I still remember the exact moment I realized that silence could be the most powerful weapon in a man's arsenal. It was not during some grand revelation or dramatic confrontation, but rather on a quiet Tuesday evening 7 years ago, sitting in a lawyer's office that smelled of old books and expensive cologne, signing documents that would change everything while knowing I could never tell a soul. The leather chair creaked beneath me as I pressed the pen to paper, my hand steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. That signature made me the secret owner of 47% of Sterling Dynamics Corporation, a company worth $1.4 billion, founded and run by a man who would become my father-in-law exactly 8 months later. His name was Richard Sterling, and he had no idea that the quiet, unassuming financial analyst he had just made a deal with would one day marry his only daughter, the love of my life, the woman I would build a home with, raise dreams with, and keep the biggest secret of my existence from. Life has a strange way of weaving threads together that should never touch, creating tapestries so complex that you cannot see the full picture until you step back far enough, until enough years have passed that the pattern finally makes sense. I am Michael Harrison, 38 years old now, though I feel decades older when I carry this weight. And I have spent the last 7 years living two completely separate lives that somehow exist in the same body, in the same house, in the same bed, next to a woman who knows everything about me except the one thing that matters most. My wife, Catherine Sterling Harrison, believes I am a senior financial consultant at a mid-sized investment firm, pulling in a respectable salary that allows us to live comfortably in our brownstone in the city, take yearly vacations to places with clear water and white sand, and save steadily for the children we have been planning to have. She believes her father is a self-made billionaire who built his empire from nothing, a man of steel and vision who conquered the corporate world through sheer determination and brilliant strategy. She believes I met him for the first time at a charity gala where I was representing my firm, where we shook hands over champagne and canapes, where he sized me up with those calculating gray eyes and decided I was worthy of his daughter's hand. Every single part of that story is a lie, except for the love. The love is the only true thing in this entire constructed narrative, and sometimes I wonder if that makes it better or worse, if the foundation of genuine emotion can support the skyscraper of deception I have built on top of it. I love Catherine with every fiber of my being, with a depth and intensity that sometimes frightens me, because I know what it means to love someone while hiding who you truly are. She is brilliant and kind, with her mother's soft features and her father's sharp mind, a combination that makes her both gentle and formidable in equal measure. She works as an art director at a publishing house, spending her days crafting visual stories for books that will sit on shelves and nightstands across the country, pouring her creativity into covers that make people stop and stare and reach out to touch. She comes home with ink on her fingers and ideas in her eyes, and she tells me about her day while I make dinner, while I chop vegetables and stir pots and listen to her voice fill our kitchen with warmth. And I think about how easy it would be to tell her everything, how the words sit right there on my tongue, heavy and urgent and desperate to be released. But I never say them, because some truths are grenades, and pulling the pin means accepting that everything will explode, that the shrapnel will tear through everything you have built, leaving nothing but smoke and ruin and the bitter taste of regret. So instead, I kiss her forehead and ask about the new fantasy novel she is designing, and I keep my secrets locked behind my teeth, guarded by 7 years of practice and the growing fear that discovery is inevitable, that eventually, somehow, the walls will come down, and I will have to face what I have done, what I have hidden, what I have protected at the cost of honesty and trust, and all the things that are supposed to make a marriage strong. The story begins, as all complicated stories do, long before the moment that seems like the beginning. I was 26 years old, fresh out of business school with a newly minted MBA and a mountain of student debt that felt like it would crush me before I ever got the chance to prove myself. I had grown up in a small town in Ohio, the son of a factory worker and an elementary school teacher. People who worked hard and loved harder and taught me that integrity mattered more than wealth, that a man's character was measured not by what he accumulated but by how he treated others when no one was watching. They were good people, My parents. The kind who volunteered at the church on Sundays and brought casseroles to neighbors who were sick and never spoke ill of anyone, even those who deserved it. They died in a car accident during my final semester of graduate school. A drunk driver running a red light on a rainy Thursday evening, gone in an instant, leaving me alone in the world with nothing but memories and the weight of their expectations and a desperate need to make something of myself that would have made them proud. I threw myself into work after graduation, taking a position at a small financial consulting firm in Chicago, crunching numbers and building models and slowly, methodically, proving that I had a gift for seeing patterns that others missed, for understanding the hidden architecture of businesses and markets, and the complex relationships between risk and reward. My mentor was a man named Thomas Chin, a partner at the firm who recognized something in me that I had not yet recognized in myself, a hunger and a sharpness that could be honed into something valuable if given the right opportunities and guidance. Thomas became the closest thing I had to family in those years, inviting me to dinners at his home where his wife would cook elaborate meals and their children would argue cheerfully about school and sports, giving me glimpses of the life I hoped to build someday when I had earned the right to slow down and breathe. It was Thomas who brought me the sterling opportunity, walking into my cramped office one spring afternoon with a file folder thick with documents and an expression on his face that I had learned meant something big was happening, something that could change trajectories and alter futures if handled correctly. He closed the door behind him, which was unusual, and sat down across from my desk, which was even more unusual, because Thomas was not a man who sat when he could pace, when he could move and think and talk with his whole body engaged in the process of problem-solving and strategy building. "Mikhail," he said, and his voice was serious in a way that made my stomach tighten with anticipation and anxiety in equal measure. "I am going to tell you about something that cannot leave this room, something that requires absolute discretion and complete trust, and I need you to understand that, before I say another word, I need to know that you are capable of keeping a secret that could destroy lives if it ever came to light." I remember nodding. Remember the way my mouth went dry and my heart started hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape my chest, trying to warn me that whatever came next would be important, would be dangerous, would be the kind of thing that divided life into before and after. I told him I understood, told him he could trust me with anything, and I meant it with every cell in my body because Thomas had given me so much already, had invested in me when I was nobody, and I would have done anything to prove myself worthy of that faith. He opened the folder and spread documents across my desk, financial statements and corporate structures and legal agreements that painted a picture of something complex and troubled, and teetering on the edge of either breakthrough or disaster. Sterling Dynamics Corporation, he explained, was a mid-sized manufacturing company that had been started 22 years earlier by Richard Sterling and his original business partner, a man named Jonathan Webb, who had recently died of a sudden heart attack at the age of 53, leaving his shares of the company in a complicated trust situation that threatened to tear apart everything they had built. Webb's widow wanted to sell, wanted to cash out and move on with her life, but Sterling wanted to buy her out and maintain control, and neither of them had the full resources to make it happen without bringing in outside investors who would dilute their power and potentially destroy the company culture they had carefully cultivated over more than 2 decades. This was where I came in, where Thomas saw an opportunity that was risky and brilliant and potentially catastrophic if it went wrong. He had connections to a group of private investors who were willing to put up the capital to buy out Webb's widow, but they needed someone they could trust to hold those shares, someone who would serve as a silent partner while Sterling maintained operational control, someone who was smart enough to understand the business, but unknown enough to avoid attention and speculation. The investors would get their return through carefully structured dividends and an eventual exit strategy. Sterling would maintain his company and his vision, and the person serving as the intermediary, as the shadow owner of nearly $500 million company, would receive a fee that would change their life, that would erase debt and create security and open doors that had previously been locked and barred. Thomas looked at me across that desk, covered in papers and possibilities, and he asked me if I was interested, if I was willing to take on this responsibility and this risk, if I understood that this was not just a financial transaction, but a covenant that would require years of silence and discretion, and the ability to hold power without wielding it, to own something without claiming it, to be someone important while remaining invisible. The fee he mentioned made my head spin, a number with so many zeros that I had to read it 3 times to believe it was real. Enough money to transform everything about my existence in ways I had only dreamed about during those long nights studying in the library, while my classmates went to parties and lived the lives I could not afford. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I was 26 years old and alone in the world and desperate to prove that I was worth something, that I could be trusted with important things, that I was more than just the son of factory workers from Ohio who had died before seeing what their boy would become. I signed the documents that made me the owner of 47% of Sterling Dynamics, with Thomas and the investors holding the other 3% as a buffer and a control mechanism, creating a structure where I technically had voting power but in practice would defer to Sterling on all operational decisions unless something went catastrophically wrong. The money arrived in my account 3 days later, and I sat in my apartment staring at the balance on my laptop screen, crying for the first time since my parents' funeral because suddenly I was free. Suddenly, the weight of debt and struggle and constant worry about survival had been lifted. Suddenly, I had choices and options, and the ability to breathe without calculating the cost. I paid off my student loans the next week. I moved into a better apartment the month after that. I bought my first tailored suit and started building a life that looked successful from the outside, that matched the role I was now playing in the shadows of the business world. And I told myself that this was temporary, that eventually the investors would exit and Sterling would buy out my shares and I would walk away with enough money to start my own firm or retire early or do whatever I wanted, and none of this would matter anymore. This secret would become just a interesting story from my past, something I could look back on and smile about without the constant anxiety that had become my unwelcome companion. But life, as I said before, has a strange way of weaving threads together. And exactly 8 months after I signed those documents in Thomas's office, I walked into a charity gala that my firm was sponsoring, wearing my new suit and trying to look like I belonged among the wealthy and powerful people who filled the ballroom with their expensive perfumes and their casual discussions of vacation homes and investment portfolios. I was there to network, to smile and shake hands, and pretend that I was comfortable in this world that still felt foreign to me, this place where people spent more on a single bottle of wine than my parents had earned in a week. And that is where I saw her, standing by the bar with a glass of white wine, and an expression on her face that suggested she was as uncomfortable at this event as I was, that she was performing the same careful dance of pretending to belong while feeling fundamentally out of place. She wore a dark blue dress that was elegant but not showy, and her hair was pulled back in a way that revealed the graceful line of her neck and the intelligence in her eyes. And when she laughed at something, the bartender said, the sound cut through the noise of the party and struck something deep in my chest, something that made me forget about networking and business and all the careful calculations I'd been making about who to approach and what to say. I walked over to her without planning to, without thinking about strategy or consequences or anything except the magnetic pull that drew me across that crowded room like I was following an invisible thread that had always connected us, that had been waiting for this moment to pull taut and bring us together. I introduced myself as Michael Harrison, financial consultant, and she smiled and said her name was Catherine Sterling, art director, and we spent the next 3 hours talking about everything except business and money and the superficial topics that dominated every other conversation in that ballroom. We talked about books and art and the strange loneliness of living in a big city where you could be surrounded by millions of people and still feel completely alone. And I felt something shift inside me, felt walls I had built start to crumble, felt the possibility of connection and understanding and maybe even love starting to take root in the careful garden of my protected heart. I did not know who her father was that night. She had mentioned him in passing, said something about family pressure and business expectations and the complicated relationship between parents and their adult children. But she never said his name, never mentioned the company, never gave me any indication that the man who was theoretically my business partner, the man whose company I secretly owned nearly half of, was the same man who had raised this incredible woman who was making me feel alive for the first time in years. I found out 3 weeks later, when she invited me to a family dinner at her parents' house in the suburbs, a sprawling estate that spoke of wealth and success and all the trappings of the life Richard Sterling had built. I pulled up the long driveway in my modest car, feeling suddenly inadequate and anxious. And when the door opened, and Richard Sterling himself stood there in casual slacks and a button-down shirt, his hand extended in greeting, I felt my entire world tilt sideways, felt the careful separation I had maintained between my two lives suddenly collapse into something dangerous and complicated and potentially catastrophic. He did not recognize me. Why would he? We had never met in person. All of our interactions had been through lawyers and intermediaries, careful layers of separation designed to maintain the fiction of distance, to protect both of us from the complications that direct contact might create. I shook his hand and smiled and introduced myself as Catherine's boyfriend, and he looked me over with those calculating gray eyes, assessing and measuring and deciding whether I was worthy of his daughter, whether I met whatever standards he had set for the kind of man who could be trusted with the most precious thing in his life. I passed whatever test he was administering, though I have never been sure exactly how or why. Maybe it was because I was respectful but not obsequious, confident but not arrogant, successful enough to suggest stability but not so wealthy that I might be after the sterling fortune. Maybe it was because his daughter was clearly happy when she looked at me, her hand finding mine under the dinner table, her laugh coming easier and brighter when I was near. Or maybe it was simply because he had no reason to suspect that the pleasant young man dating his daughter was the same anonymous investor who owned 47% of everything he had built, who had the power to destroy or transform his life's work with a single decision, who held secrets that could unravel his carefully constructed world. That night, lying in bed after Catherine had fallen asleep beside me, I made the decision that would define the next 7 years of my life. I decided to say nothing, to maintain the separation, to keep playing the role of the ordinary boyfriend who happened to work in finance, who had no connection to Sterling Dynamics beyond the tangential relationship that came from being involved with the founder's daughter. I told myself it was the right choice, the only choice, because revealing the truth would complicate everything, would potentially destroy my relationship with Catherine before it had a chance to truly develop, would introduce questions and doubts and suspicions that we might never be able to overcome. I told myself I would tell her eventually, when the time was right, when our relationship was strong enough to withstand the revelation, when I could frame it in a way that made sense and did not make me look like a liar or a schemer or someone who had deliberately infiltrated her family for mysterious and possibly sinister purposes. I told myself that the secret was not really about her, that it was a separate part of my life that had nothing to do with us, that keeping it hidden was not the same as lying, that silence was not betrayal. But 7 years have passed, and I still have not told her. And the secret has grown heavier with each passing day, each shared meal, each whispered conversation in the dark, each moment of intimacy and trust that I have accepted while knowing I am withholding something fundamental about who I am and what I have done. We got engaged 2 years after that first dinner, married a year after that, built a life together that is beautiful and comfortable and filled with all the small rituals and private jokes and shared dreams that make a marriage feel like home. And through it all, I have maintained my role as the silent partner in Sterling Dynamics, attending annual meetings via conference call under an assumed name, reviewing financial reports that arrive in encrypted emails, watching the company grow from a mid-sized manufacturer into a major industry player now worth $1.4 billion, my 47% stake increasing in value every quarter, every year, representing a fortune that I cannot touch, cannot claim, cannot even acknowledge without destroying everything I have built with the woman I love. Richard Sterling still does not know who I am. Not really. To him, I am Michael Harrison, the son-in-law who works in finance, who is good to his daughter, who shows up for family dinners and holiday gatherings and asks intelligent questions about business, without ever revealing that I know more about his company's inner workings than anyone except perhaps his CFO and his board of directors. We have developed a cordial relationship over the years, the kind of mutual respect that exists between a father and the man who married his daughter, built on boundaries and careful distance, and the understanding that we are connected by blood and circumstance, but will never be truly close. Never be the kind of family that shares everything and holds nothing back. He thinks I am successful in my own right, that I have built a decent career through hard work and intelligence, that I am a good match for Catherine because I can provide stability and security without being dependent on the sterling fortune. He has no idea that I could buy and sell his company if I wanted to, that I hold power over his life's work, that he cannot begin to imagine that every time we sit across from each other at the dinner table, I am carrying the weight of knowledge that could shatter his understanding of reality and his daughter's understanding of me. And now, after 7 years of maintaining this impossible balance, after 7 years of living in the space between truth and deception, after 7 years of telling myself that eventually I will find the right moment to reveal everything and trust that love will be stronger than betrayal, Richard Sterling has just offered me $10 million to disappear from his daughter's life, and I have no idea how to respond except to recognize that the moment I have been dreading and anticipating in equal measure has finally arrived, that the threads of my carefully woven tapestry are starting to unravel, and soon everyone will see the full picture of what I have created, what I have hidden, and what I stand to lose when the truth finally comes to light. The offer came on a Wednesday afternoon in late September, during what I had assumed would be a routine lunch meeting at Richard's Club, one of those old money establishments in the financial district where the carpets are thick enough to swallow sound and the waiters move like ghosts between tables occupied by men who control more wealth than most people will see in 10 lifetimes. Richard had called me 3 days earlier, his voice carrying that particular tone of casual authority that wealthy men perfect over decades of expecting the world to arrange itself according to their preferences, asking if I could meet him to discuss something important, something that required privacy and discretion, and the kind of conversation that could not happen over the phone or in the presence of others who might overhear and misunderstand. I had agreed immediately, as I always did when Richard requested my time, playing the role of the dutiful son-in-law who understood that maintaining a good relationship with his wife's father was essential to family harmony and domestic peace. Catherine had been pleased when I told her about the lunch invitation, interpreting it as a sign that her father was finally warming to me completely, finally accepting me not just as the man who had married his daughter, but as someone worthy of inclusion in the inner circle of his trust and confidence. She had kissed me that morning before I left for work, straightening my tie with those graceful hands that could transform blank pages into art, telling me that she loved me and that she was proud of how I had won her father over through patience and respect and consistent demonstration of good character. The guilt that accompanied that kiss was sharp enough to make me flinch, a physical pain that radiated from my chest outward like I had been struck by something blunt and merciless, but I masked it with a smile and another kiss and a promise that I would tell her all about the lunch when I got home that evening. I drove to the office carrying the weight of her trust like a stone in my pocket, heavy and undeniable, a constant reminder of everything I stood to lose if the carefully constructed walls around my secret life ever crumbled and exposed the foundation of deception upon which our marriage had been built. The morning passed in a blur of meetings and emails and phone calls that required my attention but could not fully occupy my mind, which kept circling back to the lunch meeting like a moth drawn to flame, trying to anticipate what Richard might want to discuss, running through scenarios and possibilities and potential complications. Perhaps he wanted to talk about Catherine's birthday next month, to coordinate on a surprise or discuss gift ideas, or plan some elaborate celebration that would require my participation and input. Perhaps he was thinking about succession planning at the company, wondering if I might be interested in joining Sterling Dynamics in some capacity, leveraging my financial expertise to help guide the business into its next phase of growth and expansion. The irony of that possibility was not lost on me. The absurdity of the company's founder asking the secret owner of 47% of his empire to come work for him, to accept a salary and a title and a position in the hierarchy that would place me far below my actual power and authority. I had played out that scenario in my mind dozens of times over the years, imagining what I would say if Richard ever made such an offer, how I would decline gracefully, without revealing why the suggestion was so fundamentally inappropriate, how I would maintain the fiction while navigating the treacherous waters of his expectations and my hidden reality. But nothing in my catalog of imagined scenarios had prepared me for what actually happened when I walked into that private dining room at precisely 1 o'clock. Punctual, as always, because Richard Sterling was a man who valued time and interpreted lateness as disrespect, or incompetence, or both. He was already seated when I arrived, positioned at the head of a table set for two, the remains of what appeared to be a bourbon on the rocks sitting near his right hand, the ice mostly melted, and the liquid the color of amber in afternoon sunlight. He looked older than I remembered from our last interaction 2 weeks earlier at a family dinner. His face drawn and tired in a way that suggested sleepless nights and the kind of stress that accumulates in the body like sediment at the bottom of a river, weighing everything down until movement becomes difficult and every action requires conscious effort. He stood when I entered, observing the formalities even in this private setting, and we shook hands across the expensive china and crystal that separated us like a demilitarized zone between two countries that maintained diplomatic relations while harboring mutual suspicions and unspoken resentments. His grip was firm but not aggressive, businesslike rather than warm, and when he gestured for me to sit, I noticed that his hand trembled slightly, a barely perceptible shake that spoke of either medical issues or profound anxiety or both. We ordered lunch through the ritual of menu, consultation, and waiter interaction, making small talk about the weather and the stock market and the upcoming election, dancing around whatever real purpose had brought us to this room while observing the social conventions that men like Richard considered essential to civilized discourse. The food arrived with efficient precision, plates of expensive ingredients arranged artfully, and served with minimal flourish by staff trained to be present without being intrusive, to anticipate needs without being asked, to fade into the background while ensuring that every detail of the dining experience met the exacting standards of the club and its members. I had managed 3 bites of my salmon when Richard set down his fork with the kind of deliberate motion that signals a transition from pleasantries to serious business, from the performance of casual conversation to the real agenda that had been waiting beneath the surface all along. He took a long drink of his water, cleared his throat in that particular way that suggested he had rehearsed what he was about to say, had practiced the words and the tone until they sounded natural rather than scripted, and then he looked at me with those gray eyes that had assessed 1,000 business deals and negotiations and confrontations over the decades of building his empire. "Michael," he said, and my name coming from his mouth carried a weight that made my stomach clench with anticipation and dread. "I am going to be very direct with you because I believe you are intelligent enough to appreciate honesty and because the matter I need to discuss does not lend itself to subtlety or diplomatic language. I have given this situation considerable thought over the past several months, and I have concluded that the best course of action for everyone involved is for you to end your marriage to my daughter and exit our lives permanently and completely." The words hit me like a physical blow, stunning in their directness and their brutality, stripping away any pretense of familial affection or mutual respect, and reducing our relationship to a transaction that could be terminated with the right combination of pressure and incentive. I sat frozen in my chair, my fork suspended halfway between my plate and my mouth, my brain struggling to process what I had just heard, to reconcile the polite father-in-law who had welcomed me into his family with the cold businessman who was now attempting to purchase my absence, like I was a problem that could be solved with sufficient capital investment. "I understand this comes as a shock," Richard continued, his voice steady and measured, the tone of a man accustomed to delivering difficult news to people who would not want to hear it, who had learned long ago that hesitation or visible emotion were weaknesses that could be exploited by adversaries looking for leverage or advantage. "And I want you to know that this is not a decision I have made lightly or impulsively. I have spent considerable time evaluating your relationship with Catherine, observing how you interact, assessing whether you are truly the right partner for her long-term happiness and success. And I have come to the conclusion that you are not." I found my voice finally, though it sounded strange to my own ears, tight and controlled, and barely containing the rage and hurt and absolute confusion that were churning inside me like a storm gathering strength before making landfall. What exactly are you basing this conclusion on, Richard? Has Catherine expressed unhappiness? Have I done something to offend you or fail in some way that I am not aware of? Because from my perspective, we have a strong marriage built on love and mutual respect and shared values, and I cannot understand what would lead you to this position. He smiled then, but there was no warmth in it, no humor or kindness, just the cold satisfaction of someone who believes they hold all the cards and control the outcome of the game being played. Catherine has not expressed unhappiness because she does not yet understand what she needs. What kind of man would be appropriate for someone of her background and prospects? She is blinded by emotion and physical attraction, and the romantic notion that love conquers all obstacles and makes up for fundamental incompatibilities in breeding and social position and long-term strategic alignment. The words breeding and social position hit me like slaps across the face, revealing prejudices and class consciousness that Richard had carefully concealed during our previous interactions, showing me the aristocratic disdain that had always lurked beneath his surface courtesy. His fundamental belief that people like me, people who came from factory towns and working-class parents and state universities, were categorically inferior to people born into wealth and privilege and the networks of power that sustained generational dynasties. "I see," I said, fighting to keep my voice level, to maintain some semblance of dignity in the face of this assault on my worth as a human being and a husband. "So this is about class, about my background not being sufficiently impressive for the Sterling family legacy. I had not realized that marrying Catherine required a particular pedigree or family tree that could trace back to the Mayflower or whatever arbitrary standard you use to measure a person's value." Richard waved his hand dismissively, as if swatting away an annoying insect that had momentarily distracted him from more important considerations. "Do not be dramatic, Michael. This is not about snobbery or outdated social conventions. This is about practical reality and the long-term strategic interests of my family and my company. Catherine will inherit a substantial portion of my wealth when I die, and whoever is married to her at that time will have significant influence over how that wealth is managed and deployed. I need to ensure that the person in that position understands the responsibilities that come with Sterling family resources, that they have the background and training and connections necessary to preserve and grow what I have built, rather than squandering it through ignorance or poor judgment." "And you have determined that I lack these qualities based on what evidence, exactly?" I asked, my anger now fully engaged, burning away the shock and hurt and leaving behind something harder and more dangerous, something that recognized this conversation for what it truly was. Not a family discussion, but a hostile negotiation, where Richard intended to dictate terms and expected me to accept them without resistance or counter-argument. "Based on 7 years of observation," Richard replied, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of someone who has prepared his case thoroughly and anticipated every possible objection. "Based on watching you work at a mid-level firm doing competent but unremarkable work, earning a respectable but modest salary, building a career that is perfectly adequate for someone of your background but utterly insufficient for someone married to a Sterling. Based on recognizing that you lack the connections, the relationships, the networks of power and influence that would allow you to protect Catherine's interests in the complex world of high-level finance and business strategy." He paused to take another drink of water, letting his words settle between us like sediment in still water, giving me time to absorb the full weight of his assessment and his dismissal of everything I had worked to achieve and become. "You are a good man, Michael. I do not doubt that. You are honest and hardworking, and you clearly care for my daughter in your own way. But caring is not enough when dealing with the kind of wealth and responsibility that will eventually fall to Catherine. She needs someone who understands power, who knows how to navigate the corridors where real decisions are made, who has been raised in an environment where managing enormous resources and complex interests is as natural as breathing." The irony was so profound that I almost laughed, almost broke character, and revealed everything right there in that private dining room. Almost told him that the man he was dismissing as inadequate and unsuitable actually owned nearly half of everything he had spent his life building, that I understood power better than he could possibly imagine because I had been exercising it in the shadows for 7 years, while he remained completely oblivious to my presence and influence. But I held my tongue, held my secrets close, because revealing them now would be reactive and emotional and strategically foolish, would squander whatever advantage my hidden position provided by exposing it in a moment of wounded pride rather than calculated timing. Instead, I asked the question that had been building since this conversation began, the one that cut through all of Richard's elaborate justifications and philosophical arguments about breeding and preparation and strategic alignment. What exactly are you proposing, Richard? Because I am not going to divorce Catherine simply because you have decided I am not good enough for her. She is my wife, not your property, and she has the right to make her own choices about who she wants to spend her life with, regardless of your opinions or preferences. Richard nodded, as if he had been expecting this response, as if he had already mapped out the entire conversation in his mind and was now simply following the script he had written for both of us. I am proposing a transaction, Michael. A business arrangement that acknowledges the reality of our situation and provides you with compensation for the inconvenience and disruption that ending your marriage will cause in your life. I am prepared to offer you $10 million in exchange for a clean divorce from Catherine, executed within the next 6 months, with terms that ensure you have no further contact with her or with any member of the Sterling family after the legal proceedings are finalized. $10 million. The number hung in the air between us like smoke, substantial and intangible at the same time, representing more money than most people would earn in multiple lifetimes. Enough wealth to transform existence and provide security and luxury and freedom from worry for decades to come. For someone who actually was the mid-level financial consultant Richard believed me to be, it would be a life-changing offer. The kind of opportunity that would require serious consideration despite the personal cost and emotional devastation it would entail. But I was not who Richard thought I was, and $10 million was nothing compared to the hundreds of millions my 47% stake in Sterling Dynamics represented. And the audacity of this offer, the sheer arrogance of believing that my love for Catherine and our 7 years of marriage could be purchased for any sum of money, ignited something in me that I had been suppressing for too long, anger and resentment that had been building beneath the surface of my careful performance as the grateful son-in-law who appreciated being accepted into the Sterling family orbit. "You want to pay me to divorce your daughter?" I said slowly, letting each word carry the full weight of my disgust and disbelief. "You want to treat my marriage like a bad investment that can be liquidated with sufficient capital. Like I am some kind of gold digger who only married Catherine for access to Sterling family wealth and will happily walk away if the price is right. I am not making judgments about your motivations or character," Richard said, his tone remaining infuriatingly calm and businesslike, as if we were discussing a corporate merger rather than the destruction of a marriage and a family. "I am simply being practical and recognizing that people's circumstances change, that relationships end, and that sometimes the most efficient solution to a problem is a clean financial settlement that allows everyone to move forward without prolonged conflict or emotional turmoil. $10 million is a generous offer that acknowledges the time you have invested in this relationship and provides you with resources to build whatever future you choose, free from the complications and expectations that come with being married to a Sterling." "And what about what Catherine wants?" I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to maintain composure and control. "What about her feelings and her choices and her right to determine who she loves and builds a life with? Or does she not get a vote in this transaction you are proposing?" Richard's expression hardened then, the veneer of polite business discourse cracking slightly to reveal the steel beneath, the will and determination that had allowed him to build a billion-dollar company from nothing and crush anyone who stood in his way or challenged his vision and authority. "Catherine will be upset initially, of course. Divorce is always painful, always disruptive, always carries emotional costs that cannot be easily calculated or compensated. But she is young and resilient, and she will recover, and eventually she will understand that this was the right decision, that I was acting in her best interests even if she could not see it at the time." "You are going to tell her that I am ending the marriage?" I asked, understanding now the full scope of Richard's plan, seeing how he intended to position this situation to protect his relationship with his daughter while casting me as the villain who abandoned her for money. "I'm going to tell her that you and I had a conversation about your future and that you made a choice based on your own priorities and values," Richard replied. His words, carefully chosen to provide just enough truth to be defensible while omitting the coercion and manipulation that formed the foundation of his proposal. How you explain that choice to her is your business, but I would suggest that you make it clear the decision was yours, that you recognized the fundamental incompatibilities in your relationship, that you believe ending things now is better than prolonging something that was never going to work in the long term. The calculation in his approach was breathtaking in its coldness and its strategic sophistication, creating a situation where I would be forced to either accept his offer and become the mercenary husband who sold his marriage for cash, or refuse and face whatever consequences Richard had prepared as alternative means of achieving his objective. He was giving me the illusion of choice while structuring the decision environment to ensure that every option served his interests and advanced his agenda of removing me from Catherine's life and the Sterling family orbit. I looked at him across that table covered with expensive food that neither of us was eating anymore, studied the man who had welcomed me into his home and his family while secretly harboring contempt for my background and my perceived inadequacy, and I felt something shift inside me, felt the careful balance I had maintained for 7 years begin to tip toward a different equilibrium, one where secrets would no longer be tools of protection but weapons of destruction, where silence would give way to revelation, where the power I had held in shadow would be brought into light and used to reshape the landscape of our relationships and our conflicts. "I need to be very clear about something, Richard," I said, my voice quiet now, but carrying an edge that made him lean forward slightly, his instincts recognizing that the dynamic of our conversation had shifted in some fundamental way, that the compliant son-in-law he expected to intimidate or bribe into submission was responding in ways that did not match his carefully constructed script. "I love your daughter more than anything in this world. I love her with a depth and intensity that you apparently cannot comprehend or value because it does not come attached to the right last name or the right schools or the right country club memberships. And I am not going to divorce her because you have decided she deserves someone better, because you have determined that my background makes me unsuitable for Sterling family standards." Richard started to interrupt, to reassert control over the conversation and steer it back toward his prepared arguments and strategic objectives. But I raised my hand to stop him, channeling 7 years of hidden authority into a gesture that somehow communicated that the time for his dominance had passed, that what came next would be different from anything he anticipated or could prepare for. "But I am also not naive enough to believe that you will accept my refusal and simply walk away from this plan you have constructed," I continued, watching his face carefully for signs of what he might be thinking, what additional leverage or threats or pressures he might have prepared as backup options if his initial approach failed to achieve the desired result. "So, I want you to understand something very clearly before this conversation goes any further. Before you make threats or take actions that you cannot reverse or undo once they have been set in motion." "Is that a threat, Michael?" Richard asked, his tone shifting now to something harder, more dangerous, the voice of a man who had fought battles in boardrooms and courtrooms and back alleys where business was conducted through violence and intimidation rather than contracts and negotiations. "Because if you are suggesting that you would do something to harm Catherine or damage her in any way as retaliation for this conversation, I want you to know that I have resources and connections that would make your life very difficult, that would ensure whatever action you took was met with consequences far more severe than anything you could inflict on me or my family.